In the world of chess, there are people who quit early, there are those who are on break, there are those who you still see from time to time, but there's one particular player that starts to kill everybody in OTB chess after 2 years break, like MC from shonen manga. And he is Hikaru Nakamura. To start, everybody has this belief where he's retired just because he doesn't have it anymore. And to that, he say,
Can we say you're partially retired from chess? No, I'm not retired from chess. What gave you that impression? I'm playing the World Rapid and Blitz. I'm gonna play the FIDE Grand Prix. I'm gonna win it. I'm gonna go beat Ali Rez and the candidates.
And he really shows his first step in Grand Prix, where almost all his games are inspirational to learn. For example, the second round of the first leg against Esipenko. Now, coming out a very solid game against Esipenko in the first round, Nakamura chose an English opening, an opening that gives a winning chance for both sides, and can still usually lead to a very decisive games, even in top level play. And in this position plays Queen to C2. This I think is amazing because it shows that level of preparation that he did. First of all, he can do knight takes d5, something that players have done multiple times, hundreds of times maybe. More common lines also just pawn to d3, and at the end of the day, maybe plays queen to c2 or bishop b3, bishop to b2. These are possible moves. Even a weird move like queen to b3 is possible, where let's say after knight to f6, place d3, pawn to a3, things like that. In this position shows queen to c2, which means that he has prepared something at home to really catch Esipenko off guard. Now, a couple of options are available for Esipenko. However, if he decides to just trade off the knight on c3, then congratulations, he opens the d-file for him, for the rook to get in to attack him, and so that would be, terrible choice for black. And he plays knight to f6. But what's amazing about this is that from here on out, Hikaru Nakamura just plays simple chess. Rook to e8, he has a chance to take the bishop, and so he does. Took the bishop, plays e3, challenge the pawn in the center of the board, so that after the takes, he takes. Now again, he opens a d-file, but in this particular position, Esipenko plays pawn to d3. Now I don't know if this is actually a preparation, but this pawn to d3 move, I think is a bad move. Obviously because if he overpush, this pawn can be a weakness. Apparently he has nothing that can protect this pawn on d3, except for his lone queen on d8. And if you think about it, what actually has a light squared bishop that can attack the light squared pawn here on d3, along with the queen on c3 or c4 that attacks the pawn on d3 as well? Well, that is very possible. Or via f1 as well, this bishop can also attack the pawn on d3. And so if you think about it, this pawn can be a real weakness if it's left down into the end game. Now because the queen is attacked, queen c3 is played, and after knight to e4, plays queen to c4. I'm just getting out the attack, very normal here, very simple chess, or something that we can actually learn as well. Now after bishop to f5, protecting the knight, protecting the pawn as well on d3 in the future. We do first see bishop to b2, and again, just another simple threat, simple chess, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just not even caring about the knight pawn on d2 because queen c3 attacks the pawn with checkmate. So this is actually pretty cool, but he actually has a plan of bishop to b2. It's not just, a mere tactic. After queen to d7, connecting the rook and also try and get the queen into play a little bit more. Nakamura in this position plays a move that made me think that he is a reincarnation of Bobby Fischer. In this position, plays bishop takes on e4. Now, we talk about this bishop attacking a pawn on d3 because it's stuck on the light squares. Something like bishop to f1, bishop d3 is cool. But he recognizes that the knight here is very strong sitting on e4. There's not a lot of pieces that can kick it. Additionally, if we play pawn to f3 and knight to d6, this might be a little bit difficult for white to win. The bishop being blocked on g2 as well. Queen has no real purpose. If queen to c3, I think there's always f6. Queen to d4 here. Plays pawn on e4 next is possible. And to be honest, maybe it's not easy at all. To add, black does not really have to play knight to d6 in this position. He can play intermezzo of pawn to b5. Firstly attacking the queen, and the queen moves somewhere, let's say to c1, which is not very active. He can come back to d6. Now this one is an improvement of what I said earlier. Now he has a c4 square as well. This will be better for black to play. And so he understands this key principle that b5 can be a move, and knight d6 can be a move, and so on. Knight is strong, and so that's why he just took the knight away, placed pawn to f3. Now what he's done in this position is that he's trying to maximize the simplest attacking plan, which is attacking on the dark squares. Now he does have the dark squared bishop, and if you think about it, the weakness is not just the pawn here on d3, but also the pawn here on c7 and f7. that is weak and backward. And so which pawn is easier to attack? It is really the pawn on c7 here. He does have the rook coming to c1, we can double it. In the future, we can play queen to f4 as he played in the game, all to target a pawn c7, and so that makes c7 pawn easier to target, easier to attack. And so for the next few moves, he just does that. Rook to c1, rook to e7, queen to f4. Now, pawn to f6 I don't think is an important move in this position, however it does blunt the bishop on f6, and after rook to c4, rook to c1, he's just trying to attack the c7 pawn as I said. In this position, there are a couple important moves that black can place. Pawn to b5 remaining one of them, attacking the rook. The rook has to move to, let's say, c3 and or d4. Now on d4 is attacking the queen, obviously c3 is not, so it's less passive. Rook to d4 attacks the queen. Now Andre can move queen to c8 or queen to e8 for that matter, but what is most important is that he can play pawn to g4 now, Hikaru Nakamura, and let's say after the exchange, and queen to e6, Nakamura can continue to push forward on the king side and try to attack black as soon as possible with this pawn storm. That said, it's still not easy for white to win this game immediately if Esipenko had played pawn to b5. In this particular position, he plays queen to e6, which sets him to a path of tactic that can kill himself. Which is why Hikaru Nakamura is one of the best players in the field as well, just because he can find these delicate tactics that can really be missed by his opponent. In this position, he plays pawn to b5, attacking the bishop, deflecting it. The bishop moves to somewhere, let's say to d5. Already rook to c7 is devastating for black. He lost a pawn. And let's say after rook takes c7, we can jump in with our queen, which is pretty cool. Infiltrating on the back rank, attacking a rook on d8. Well, that's not nice. In this position, Esipenko plays bishop takes on b5, taking a pawn in return for the trouble that he has in the future. In this position, again, Nakamura can still place rook to c7, and after rook to c7, queen takes c7. But you know what he did? He plays into the nuance of his position. He plays rook to e4, tempoing the queen. And the difference is that after the queen moves to c7, and the rook takes on e7 as he did in the game, and rook c7, he's again tempoing the queen. So the queen has to move. Now pretty clearly, if the queen moves to, let's say, d6, we can just exchange the queen, takes the pawn d7. And if queen to e6 of some sort, we still can take on b7, and b6 is next, along with b5 bishop that is standing there. And so Esipenko plays rook to d7, protecting all pieces on the 7th rank from the assault of the white rook. However, this then allows rook to c8 check. After rook to d8, Hikaru Nakamura plays a brilliant C in the whole Grand Prix leg. I think he plays in this position, bishop takes on f6. Now this is crazy, because I wonder how far this bishop to f6 was planned. Is it from the move b5 in this position? Or is this actually played after rook to d7 and rook c8? It is not clear. However, after rook to c8, rook to d8, bishop to f6 is played, and he sees another few moves ahead, and that is proved by the fact that if the queen takes on f6, queen takes f6, the pawn takes f6 is devastating, because after rook takes d8, this is check, and we're left with very weak pawns and the queen and king side, and we're just up in exchange. This is going to be winning for white. In the game, g takes f6 is played, thinking there's nothing happening. However, in this position, the king is already too ripped open, too exposed in the dark, and also the light squares in this position. In this position, Hikaru Nakamura plays queen to g4 check, and after the king moves to f8, rook takes d8 and queen to b4, releasing a check on the dark squares. However, very coincidentally, geometrically, the bishop is also placed on d5, and the queen on to e7, queen takes b5, swinging that bishop. Now, could he have, let's say, moved to h8 and avoid the check on dark squares? Well, then Hikaru Nakamura also sees queen to b4 regardless. The thing is, after queen takes b4, rook takes d8, the same thing we talked about earlier. And after that, of course, the king moves, just pawn takes b4. This will be winning for white. And if you do think that we can just take the rook first on c8, well, then you lose the queen on e7. Well, black has technically a rook and a bishop, but you know, all this pawn are too weak on the queen and the king side. White's just going to win this. And so this awesome thing about Hikaru Nakamura in this comeback is that he sees everything, but also plays the simplest chess possible and leaves out multiple chances to confuse his opponent. And this position that we can see after the queen is traded and pawn being on h6, white is just up a couple of pawns. Black's pawns are terrible. In this position, and Esipenko just resigned the game. It's just truly amazing. Simplest opening from the start to the point where he plays pawn to b5, and in the end of the day, just found a nuance that leads to bishop takes on f6. A brilliant tactic that eventually wins him the game. The second game is between Hikaru Nakamura and Rapport, and we're just going to skip the opening because that's not what we are focusing on. Just know that white just plays a very simple opening, very classic from the Kasparov age. And in this position, after both sides traded queens, everybody will have thought this probably will go into a drawn equal endgame. However, in this position, after rook to f8 is played from Rapport, in this position, Hikaru Nakamura plays a fantastic move. He does have the option in this position to play, let's say, knight to e6, and after that pawn to f4. This is a viable option, although compared to black's kingside pawns, white's kingside pawn is probably nothing to speak of. And obviously, it's not going to play, let's say, knight takes on e6, because knight here on f4 doesn't really have a future. He can take on e6, but then it allows rook to f2, and next will be knight to b3, and knight to c4 trying to attack white. This will be bad if white allows such counterplay. And so Hikaru Nakamura correctly doesn't play that. He instead, in this position, plays a fantastic move, and that is bishop takes on g6. This is crazy, but confusing the opponent is Nakamura. First of all, if black plays pawn takes on g6, a very clear plan of knight takes on e6 would have occurred after, let's say, pawn takes on f6. Well, that's not pawn takes f6. Let's say pawn takes on e6 in this position. Then we can in fact place knight to g6. Now the difference in this position is that we are now attacking both rooks at the same time. And so after, let's say, rook to f2, we can play knight to f8. Excuse me, knight to h8. And even though black has this knight to c4 move that really seems like it's attacking the white king, the secret is that if, white doesn't really leave the second rank, the first rank, and his rook's protected, the position will be fine for white to play. And not to mention, what ends up in this position is that white has two passed pawns and black only has one rook. And this normally is not enough to stop two passed pawns that is going to be storming down the board. And so this position is terrible to play for black. So what can you do anyway? Black can play rook to e8, threatening to take the knight the second time because knight takes g6 is no longer a fork. But then white can play knight to c5, and after, let's say, g5 attacking the knight, knight h5. This is still something to be terrified for, especially if white can play, let's say, pawn to h4 and pawn to f4. These connected passed pawns will prove something for white in the future. And so black doesn't take that. And obviously, I suppose everyone sees after f takes g6, we just place knight to e6 attacking the rook. This position would have been better for white to play. So he doesn't take that as well. Instead, plays knight to b3 attacking the rook with the idea if the rook moves to d1, then say we can take the bishop next move. With the critical difference is that after, let's say, knight ge6 and knight takes g6, rook takes f2, the knight's already here on b3. Next one will be knight to c4, and this will be devastating for white instead. Nakamura in this position plays bishop takes g6, confusing opponent since the opponent only has 30 minutes left at this point. He also then prevents counterplay to not play, let's say, rook to d1 and all this weird move with knight to e6, rook to f2 move. He does that pretty well by playing knight takes on e6, just sacrificing the exchange outright. Clear idea is that after you take mine, I'll take yours. But then after pawn takes e6, he still does a move that plays knight takes on h7, now allowing rook takes f2. With a clear idea after rook takes on f2, rook to c2, we can in the end of the day exchange, but this would have been proved so much better for black since the knight here is stranded on b3 and b6, and you see this pawn here ready to march up forward. Again, as I said, black only has one rook, and normally that's not enough to stop connected passed pawns. So this is well planned by Hikaru Nakamura, except black just doesn't play that. He keeps the rook by playing rook to g8. Now attacking the bishop first, the bishop then has to move to d3, and instead it is white who loses the exchange on c1. However, the compensation is that he has this connected passed pawn that can push on the king's side. It's going to be very, very scary. Now, according to the computer, Rapport has the way to defend if he had just played something rook to h4 in this position. This stops the pawn from moving forward, and the plan with pawn to f4, pawn to f5 doesn't really work because now he has this e6 pawn to stop that f5 push. g5 doesn't really create anything. at the moment, and black probably can play, let's say, knight to c4, knight to d6 to just reroute the knight back into the game. Knight to c8, knight to e7 doesn't really seem ridiculous as well. In this position though, Rapport plays rook takes on f6, sacrificing back the exchange, although I don't really know why. Probably he's very afraid of this passed pawn. But if you think about it, after rook to f6 and rook h6, he does only have one pawn to stop. And so probably he thought that it's just going to be very easy to defend from here. The fact is that it's not. The king then is rushed to g4. After that, bishop to g6. We can see that all white's pieces are in harmony on the light squares, while black's knight is still stranded on c8. Following all principles that bishop is better than the knight in all endgames, we can already assess his position as losing for Rapport. Of course, Nakamura still has to work for it, and let's say after knight to d6, we do see a couple of exchanges here that leads to the point where Nakamura just up a pawn on the king side, but black still has some passed pawns on the queen side that Hikaru Nakamura has to be worried of. In this position, rook to f5 and rook to b2 proves that he's just going to be pushing all his pawns on the queen side, but sadly enough, white's pawn, the center of the board, are fast, and white's just always going to be one step ahead of stopping this pawn to promote. As you can see, he can't push b2 because he loses the pawn. He can't push a3 as well because he loses the pawn on b3. And so yeah, white is just going to be one step ahead of promoting this pawn, while black, with the stranded king and really weak pawns and stranded rooks, it's just going to be tough to defend this endgame. And in this position, Rapport just resigned. Nakamura won the semi-final. He then went on to eliminate Levon Aronian in the final. Now the third game isn't some Nakamura playing sacrificing move to win some brilliancy prize. However, it's just that when Esipenko and Nakamura plays, it is always about Esipenko attacking Hikaru and then not making it at the end of the day, which is pretty cool. This position stems out from the bishop opening, and very quickly f4 is played on the king side. And Esipenko, noticing that there's nothing on the queen side worth the fight, black's pretty solid with this pawn structure here on the queen side, and so f4 is pretty quickly launched in this position. More than that, black's also played g6 in this position, so if you can play, let's say, pawn to f5 to attack the hook on the king side, that would have been pretty good, just ripping off the king side's armor. Of course, Hikaru Nakamura plays pawn takes f4 and rook takes f4, and this position is ensued. Knight to h5, attack the rook on f4, and after rook to f3, we do see rook being brought down to f1, attacking the king side fully. And what's funny is that black really takes the pawn on a5, which is really not common already on a top level play. Taking the rim pawn that is not relevant in the attack, ignoring the attack on the king side, sort of, is what I think one of the best moment, and also one of the maybe inspirational moment in the third Grand Prix right here. Because really what I think about it, right, is that Esipenko in next move plays pawn to g4, and after knight to g7, this is a scary territory and position to play on, especially with the white's pawn controlling the center of the board, and the knight being kicked out to the second rank where it does nothing. But Hikaru Nakamura shows his class in this position. He's not afraid, even let's say after knight to f5, straight up sacrificing the piece again against Hikaru Nakamura and needing a win at the time to, let's say, advance to the KO group. Esipenko just has to try this knight to f5 move, because even after, let's say, the pawn takes on f5 and pawn takes f5, we can see the trade on f5, multiple trade on f5 to, let's say, take out the pawn chain and place pawn to f6. Although in this position, Hikaru Nakamura did claim that he's probably terrified to go into this position just because how destroyed the king side is on the king side, and this knight still hasn't found a future that he belongs to. So he avoids that clearly and plays the queen to e5, centralizing the queen and now protecting the knight on g7. But most importantly, after knight to h6 attacking f7 pawn, he stays chill and does nothing to change the structure of the position. Now what it means by that is that after, let's say, he takes the pawn d5 and takes the pawn d5, he's just going to change structure of the position, where now white has just a tremendous pressure on the center of the board, attacking e6 square, and probably after, let's say, bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5, black will then be required to play something like pawn to f5 to then make full use of the f pawn so that won't fall without any fight. So that is very important in terms of preserving the win, And so that's why after knight to d5 doesn't do anything except playing pawn to g5. This may be inaccuracy from the computer, but as you can see here, the knight is also just pretty stuck. He does not have the square on g4. All he does have is the square on f5. However, in this position, what changes is that after, let's say, pawn takes on d5, the pawn takes on d5, we now have a piece that we can capture with a bishop on f5. We're not forced to capture the piece on d5 anymore. So let's say bishop takes on f5, rook takes f5, or pawn to f5 for that matter, because rook takes f5 is forced to knight takes f5. We can already claim that we have one piece up, and in this position we're just going to win. So yeah, maybe it's just very difficult to assess from human side that this is actually inaccuracy, but play continues anyway. Esipenko plays queen to f2 attacking the pawn, but then after, let's say, pawn to f5, which is a great find by the way, again not surrendering the f-pawn without a fight, he pushed pawn to f5. But the key idea is that after, let's say, e takes on f5, we can take the knight and place queen to f6. Again, as you can see, the configuration is that the knight is going to be stuck here forever. And even after rook to h3, now great, the rook here is stuck protecting the knight who is stuck on h6. So this position probably will have been better for black. And if he plays g takes on f5, which happens in the game, then Nakamura also has bishop takes d5. And after that, as you can see, black knight now has a future of bringing the knight to h5 and then towards f4, where he harass key square like g2, e2, h3 for multiple checkmate idea. And so suddenly when white has all this attack and pressure on the f-file and black doesn't really have a future of his knight, he found his move f5, changing the structure of the position forever. That guarantees him, no matter what white does in this position, he's just going to get multiple plays. And so this is really one of the top qualities as well from Hikaru's comeback, is that he knows when to break and when to change the position. For me, that's just something incredible, especially at the pressure of Grand Prix and his opponent relentlessly attacking him from the start of the game. So f5 played, and after g f5, which happens in the game, knight to h5 and knight to f4 ensues in this position. Esipenko though did sacrifice the rook for the knight because the knight is just too strong, and does try to push the pawn on f7. However, there's just nothing. Let's say pawn to f7 is played. We in this position have rook to e1. Let's not forget that. But even that, let's say after rook takes e8, we can play queen takes on e8 and not, let's say, rook takes on e8, because after f7, rook to f8, we're just going to have, let's say, queen to d4. That's checkmate. That will be brutal. But if you don't play rook to f8, there will be no pieces who stops the pawn to promote. And so rook to e8 is bad. But after rook to e8, we can play queen takes on e8. The idea is that even after pawn takes pawn to f7, we can just stop this with queen takes on f7 and we're winning. While in this position, this does not have enough. And he plays queen to d6, let's say, with pawn takes on f6 as a threat. Then we can just play queen to f7, there's just nothing here. Or play rook to g8, that's more straightforward, attacking a knight here on g4. So there's nothing to begin with, so that's why I think Esipenko in this position throws out his advantage and, so to speak, drawing chances. He plays in this position rook to f1. It is in fact the attacking side who fails to convert and the one who cracks in the end, not the one who keeps defending. And so that's why I think Hikaru Nakamura is the best defender and also attacker after this comeback, because he knows how to defend and how to attack simultaneously without making it easy for his opponent. After rook to f6, actually, it's just resignation from Esipenko Andri. The thing is, after queen to d4 attack, avoiding the attack from the rook, we can see queen to e4 check. This is brutal. Thing is, after queen trade, this is just going to be nothing for white. And so that's why Esipenko just resigned here. His performance in the Grand Prix really shows me that he's back in the sense of the mental toughness and his ability of playing chess, probably because of the rest of 2 years, probably because of the Blitz chess online. But no matter what it is, I am very grateful to the fact that he's back on the board and showing some class. Hopefully he does that more often in the future as well. Now, part of the reason why I'm hyping Hikaru Nakamura a lot in this video is that if you look at the game that he played 3 years ago, this is the game he plays in the World Cup in 2019, you'd have thought that he's going to retire pretty soon. Just straight up. Because if you think about it, and if you look at this position, you'll have seen that white sacrifices a very quick development and quick checkmate from on the center of the board. Black usually takes his time to figure out what his opponent's doing. But in this position, Hikaru Nakamura plays pretty quickly, practically blitzing his position out. If you remember, if you watched his game on the 2019 World Cup, he blitzed out his position, plays bishop to d6, which is still fine, but after bishop to f4, he plays pawn to f5. This is still blitzing his move. I don't know what this move is actually. This is just like a intermediate player blundering a pawn or something, because after bishop takes on e5, and I'm sure everybody sees it, and bishop to e5, there's a rook to d8 checkmate. And so in fact, I don't really know what he's doing back then. All I know is that he's playing very, very poorly. Almost every game, he has advantage of, he fails to convert, and he plays badly in this position. He often loses in the opening as well. And so yeah, based on the fact that he blitzed out the move pawn to e5 back in 2019, and the fact that he's defending against Esipenko's rampage twice, just clearly shows me that his class is back. And really, he's showing that why he's also one of the top guns in the field. But that's my 3 best games of Hikaru Nakamura in the Grand Prix. Obviously 3 games are not enough. Every game that he plays pretty fine, pretty good. But yeah, due to time constraint, I'm just gonna limit it to 3. Hopefully you can just type it down in the comment which game you like the most, and which game inspired you the most as chess player. And yeah, that said, if you learned something from this video, if you got inspired, please do consider pressing like button. That will help my channel a lot. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.